Hi everyone, it's Emily, and one of the questions I receive on the channel quite often is what are my thoughts about sealed game collecting? If you're a new viewer to this channel, welcome. But if you've been following me for some time, you know that I've brought up how I like to consider myself a curated collector. So my philosophy around game collecting is I enjoy buying games that I really enjoy and one day intend to play. Now, of course, with all the adult responsibilities like working a full-time job and other social obligations, it's really difficult to find time to play games these days, especially a lot of the games I really enjoy, which are usually very long RPGs. But I found a lot of joy hunting down and researching types of games that I really want to add to my collection that I think I would really enjoy. And if I don't get to play it right away, it's going to sit in my library of games that I'll one day get to enjoy. Now, having said that, I don't really keep sealed games on hand. There are some games that happen to be sealed still because I just haven't opened them yet, but I don't really have the intention to keep them sealed. Now, I'm not making this video to shame or criticize how other people like to go about collecting. I think that's one of the great things about collecting. Everyone gets to choose how they want to go about it. But I'm going to bring up a few points about why I personally don't keep my games sealed. And towards the end, I'm going to go a little bit more in depth about why you should maybe reconsider sealed collecting for certain consoles that I think a lot of people have been overlooking. So the number one reason why I don't collect sealed games is because I like looking inside them. Especially for collector's editions that have all the goodies inside, I really like to open them up and look at them. Like the game I shared in my thumbnail, Ys 8 Lacrimus of Donna. I have the PS5 collector's edition and it came with a soundtrack, a photo book, a cloth poster, some bookends, and I really like to use a lot of these items for display purposes on my bookshelves. So as I shared in my previous video, I am currently setting up some new bookshelves to display my collections, and this is a little sneak peek of what my little Ys section looks like on my shelf, using many of the items that were included inside these collector's editions. Now, not every collector's edition contains really cool items that could really enhance your displays, but a lot of them also contain things like art books or soundtracks that I really like to flip through or listen to. Now on to reason number two. This kind of circles back to my last video where I don't like double dipping for games. So if I buy a game intending to keep it sealed, that means I'm gonna have to buy the game somewhere else if I really want to play it. So not only do I like to consider myself a curated game collector, I also like to consider myself a kind of budget physical collector as well. So some of these double dipping practices kind of compromises my tendency to try to buy games on sale for the lowest price possible. But one of the things I've noticed a lot of sealed collectors like to do is they like to purchase the console game and keep it sealed and then buy the game digitally. So sometimes this makes sense, especially if you want to keep the collector's edition intact by going the digital route, especially if you could grab them super cheap. Financially, this can make a lot of sense to some, especially if you look at the indie game releases. So a lot of those collector's editions from those limited print companies go for an unreasonable amount of money on the aftermarket sometimes, especially for the very popular titles. Whereas oftentimes you could just buy them on Steam or digitally somewhere else for just a couple dollars. So for that reason, I do understand. However, I don't really partake. Now, conversely, I've also heard of many collectors who like to buy games digitally first to kind of test the waters out to see if they actually want to go and buy the physical collection. So that might make sense for some people. It's just nothing I have personally partaken in. Now, I guess the opposite of why a lot of people like to participate in the sealed game collecting hobby. I don't really like to keep my games sealed because I'm not into the financial speculation of it all. Now, I've sort of touched upon this in a previous Q&A video, but I'm not really in this hobby for financial reasons. And not to say that there's anything wrong with that. Just when it comes to investments and things like that, my approach is really not to rely on speculation assets, but to invest in things that are a bit safer. I guess I need to have a disclaimer now that this is not financial advice, but when it comes to your investment portfolio, really, you don't want more than 5% to be speculative assets. The bulk of your money should be tied with more reliable assets, like for example, the S&P 500, which averages 10% every 10 years, and has become a very popular asset to invest in to keep up with inflation and create wealth. I totally understand the appeal of handpicking a certain game and predicting it's going to gain like 10x or something in 10 years. And again, I think that's great if you want to pursue that as a hobby, but not as the bulk of your investment portfolio. And it's really possible that something from my collections could be worth something in the future. It's not really the intention of why I bought them. Again, I like to buy things that I like. And if I fell on financial hardships or something, it'd be nice to have that as a backup. Though really, you should have an emergency fund, but this is not a financial channel, so I won't get too deep into this. And I think a lot of pop culture and video games and those sort of nostalgic type of items are really difficult to sell on the collectible market long term. Nostalgia always comes in cycles and can sometimes be unpredictable about what kind of ebbs and flows as the popular or more desirable things to get at a certain time and what really just falls off completely. We see many bubbles and things like, for example, Beanie Babies and a lot of other things, I think, especially from the 80s, 90s, 2000s, have been marketed as collectibles or kind of desirable items to have and not necessarily rare. So whenever I come across individuals who, for example, completely stockpile the Super Mario 3D All-Star collections on the Nintendo Switch, you're gonna have to wonder how many other people are doing this and really how rare is having a sealed mint box gonna be in 10, 20 plus years. So I think there is definitely a fine line when it comes to making such speculations about how to evaluate something as rare or desirable. So they definitely can overlap or be separate. So you could have something that's super rare, only maybe 100 copies were made, but no one knows about it or really cares to own it. Or you could also have something that is a really popular franchise and title that everyone wants, but they're sort of a dime in a dozen, especially if you're trying to look for a mint sealed condition sort of box that you and a few hundred other people had speculated on. So I'm just gonna say this all is more complicated than I think some speculators want to believe. But I also wanted to talk about the kind of pitfalls when it comes to reselling and all the kind of headaches that come with it too. So as someone who does do casual reselling of hobby stuff, I don't do this so much for games. I do this more for some of my other hobbies, like on eBay and Mercari. But there's so much bookkeeping you have to do with this, and it's really sometimes more trouble than it's worth. And I've noticed this trend, at least here in the US, that there's been a lot more burden placed on the shoulders of resellers, usually more casual resellers who are not a business and haven't kept the receipts for the items they've bought and can kind of accurately say how much they profited on something for capital gains and all those taxes we have to be careful about. And I think there's gonna be more legislation placed in the future to make that more complicated. So it's honestly not something I wanna kind of worry about or be part of and fall into trouble with like the IRS or something. That is honestly something I would rather avoid, and finding alternative venues to resell things like at swap meets or through like Facebook Marketplace or things like that. It's just becoming a lot more difficult these days, and who knows how it's going to be 10 years from now. So in short, I don't really like the idea of speculative investments, and honestly, reselling is such a chore and not something I really want to consider doing too much in the future. And one of the reasons why I don't want to keep my games sealed for those intended purposes. Now for the final reason that I think is often overlooked by many people, especially those who collect for game preservation purposes. So I've talked about cart versus disc-based collecting on the channel briefly, and something I could definitely expand upon in the future. But I really like to collect cart-based games for multiple reasons. And one of the reasons is they're a bit sturdier compared to mini discs, even the Blu-ray discs they're using for PS4 and PS5 nowadays. And so you don't have to worry about things like scratches or disc rot, which the Blu-ray discs definitely handle those better compared to the CD-ROMs or the DVDs that the previous generations have used. But we've seen this with a lot of the previous Nintendo products of just how well they've held up over the years. Now, there's been a lot of information that's come out of the woodworks, I would say, for the past couple years about what sort of flash memory a lot of these cart-based games use nowadays. There's been a lot of speculation of the lifespan of some of these cart-based games from the DS, 3DS, and Switch eras because of how Nintendo switched the way that they keep their memory on their carts. I'm gonna link a few articles in the description box to kind of explain in more detail about the differences that you see in the different consoles and what sort of flash memory is being used and how they differ, especially regarding lifespan. But in short, Nintendo introduced a new way to write their games onto game cards. And they're ones that are not as robust as what we've seen in the earlier eras that have been lasting for decades already. So despite being a proud physical game collector, I do know that physical media does have a shelf life. And there's been a lot of reports saying that a lot of these game cards are only gonna maybe last 10 to 20 years, unfortunately, depending on what process was being used. So it's really unfortunate for some of the game cards that I personally collect, like the Nintendo DS, as well as the PS Vita, that used some of the older technology. But if you do collect for the 3DS and the Nintendo Switch, there is some hope of how to expand the lifespan of these game cards, fortunately. And that is simply just putting the game cards into your system and letting the sort of internal program to correct any sort of corruption that might be happening on your game cart. Again, I'll link some articles down below for your own reference on this topic. And I do want to point out that this is not going to be a surefire way to just avoid all corruption altogether. The internal self-repairing program only goes so far. For example, there are a few 3DS games that are known to have problems coming from a bad batch, such as the Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire games. I think this was especially apparent in the PAL copies, where a lot of them were just fully corrupted and stopped working altogether. I think I first saw this through a Nintendo Life article, so I'll link that down below too for those curious. Another game that was known to have bad batches for the first print runs here in North America was Persona Q. And I actually ended up getting a second print copy of this, thankfully, through Video Games Plus. So this is supposed to not have the same issues that the first print run release did. So I'm bringing this topic up not because of any kind of fear-mongering or anything like that when it comes to collecting sealed games, but I think it is important to know, especially for those who collect the 3DS and Switch in particular. For the other game cards that unfortunately don't have the same internal repairing mechanism that the 3DS and Switch have, basically if you just do general maintenance to make sure that they're clean and stored in a safe environment that doesn't get too hot or have too much moisture or things like that, it should increase the chances of the games being safe and preserved for a long time. But for the 3DS and Switch in particular, I think this is an important reason why not to keep these games sealed and to insert them into your game system every now and then to make sure that there's no sort of corruption happening that could be easily avoidable if you just play or just insert the game into your hardware system. So you can argue that this doesn't apply to games that are not the 3DS or Switch, but I would argue that it's good to kind of know whether or not the games you have are working, because I think there are two main camps why people keep games sealed. One is for reselling investment purposes, another is just to keep them safe and to play later. So I think for both instances, you probably want to know whether or not the game works, especially if you're going to be selling something to someone else and they come back asking for a refund because the game doesn't work or something like that. That just sounds like a headache and a hassle that I personally wouldn't want to deal with. And keeping a game sealed for your own playing purposes, I personally would want to know whether a game works sooner rather than later, especially if prices continue increasing as we've been seeing lately, especially for certain titles. You don't want to have a dead game that doesn't work and have to resort to buying a more expensive copy or something like that. But there are of course people who don't keep games sealed for those particular reasons. Some like to just use them for display purposes, and keeping the cellophane on there helps kind of preserve the box and everything, which I think is fine. So those are my 4 main reasons why I'm personally not a sealed collector. I want to reiterate that, again, I'm not trying to criticize anyone with how they go about collecting, and if you want to keep being a sealed collector, that is perfectly fine in my book. And I'm sure there are plenty of reasons I didn't touch on for why someone is or isn't a sealed game collector. So let me know down below if you happen to be a sealed game collector, or if there are certain games that you like to keep sealed while the rest open, or how do you like to balance your collecting? I'll be very curious to know, and also I love a good discussion with different viewpoints of how people go about collecting. But that's all for today. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and until my next one, bye guys.